Good afternoon and welcome to bookmakers.com TV. I am delighted to once again be joined by David Payne, also known as the boxing writer on Twitter for all you boxing aficionados out there. And we're back again to review to preview, I should say, another fight this weekend for Chris Eubank Jr., who this time faces up against Liam Smith after his match against Conor Benn was postponed or cancelled, we should say, due to a failed drugs test. So we've David with us today to preview this weekend's fight. And David, I'm going to open by asking, as I kind of alluded to the last time we spoke, Eubank Jr. was facing up to fight Conor Benn, and the latter then kind of failed a drugs test. So how will Eubank have spent the intervening months, and will he have had any downtime? Obviously, the festive period. Is there any fear he might be burnt out? If he was geared up for a fight in October, it's now January. That's an extra 3 months where he's kind of maybe needed to be at full tilt. Or what would you say his overall physical condition is going to be?
Well, hello Darren, hello listeners. I think the one thing that we can be fairly certain of with Chris Eubank Jr., he has some flaws, but the one thing that isn't a flaw in his makeup is his fight readiness. So yes, it will have been frustrating for him for all the criticism there was of that Conor Benn fight, and obviously the unsavoury fallout from Conor Benn's failed tests, which were still unbelievably, but typical for boxing, trying to unravel. It was a messy period, and I'm sure trying to boil himself down to the reduced weight, which is what he was due to do to fight Conor Benn, will have been punishing and difficult. So in some ways, getting back to his more natural weight limit of 160, the middleweight limit, the classic middleweight limit, will probably be some comfort, and will probably he will find it easier to do than he was certainly trying to get down to the lower limit for Benn. So it's always hard being the kind of sofa side psychologist of whether it's going to impact his motivations, how it's affected his readiness, whether he's as up for this fight as he may have been. Who knows whether he's a bit drained from going through two camps? Who knows? It's always difficult. But what history we have got, the certainty we have got, is that Eubank always arrives physically in tip-top shape. And I don't think he's someone who lets that slip, despite his social media profile professing that he's forever eating KFCs, etc., which is, I think, largely for the crowd and to keep himself a little bit of buzz on those platforms, which works, it would seem. So no, I'm expecting Eubank to be in pretty good condition, and I suppose the secondary tier to that is how motivated or how much of a risk he believes Liam Smith is going to present.
Well, I suppose leads into my next question. You've obviously written an article for bookmakers.com, which we'll share in the description of this video, where you've kind of outlined how you see the fight going. But one line from your article was that Liam Smith is almost the antithesis to Eubank Jr. He's going to be less familiar to our viewers and listeners, despite his age. He is 34, but he's had, perhaps, I don't know whether this is unfair, perhaps more of a journeyman career than Eubank Jr. Can you explain maybe why he is Eubank's polar opposite, both in terms of maybe how he conducts himself and also his boxing style?
Yes, of course. I think Chris Eubank, much like his father, has tried to position himself as something different, as an antithesis to almost everyone else in boxing. Chris Eubank, it felt a bit fresher and a bit newer and more annoying, perhaps. And he was a tremendous fighter to back that up, but he always positioned himself as someone who doesn't like boxing, who only does it for the money, etc., who looked down his nose at all the other people, his great opponents like Nigel Benn, etc. And Chris Eubank Jr. has become a little bit of a facsimile in terms of style and posture of his father. So I wouldn't describe your terminology. I know there was no intent, but I wouldn't describe Liam Smith as a journeyman career, but I would describe him as more of a blue collar orthodox career. He's reached some heights. He's won a world title belt. They're often devalued a little bit these days, but he's won a belt at that level. He's fought in America, and he's fought Canelo Alvarez, who I'm sure viewers have heard of as one of the #1 guys in the sport for the last 10 years, and performed pretty well if you go back and watch that fight. So he's been around the block, as they say. As you say, he's 34. He's well known as a boxing figure in the British scene and a little beyond for those that follow the sport closely because of those fights that I mentioned, and because he's part of a boxing family that has been central to all of British boxing for the last 10, 15 years. He's one of 4 brothers to have won a British title, which is an astonishing thing in and of itself. And all 4 have fought at world level, challenged for world honours, and his brother Callum has won a world title. So he's very familiar, and you almost feel like all their careers merge into one to some degree. But certainly from a familiarity point of view, he's a very well-known face. For every time his brothers fight, Liam would be there, as well as his own 35, 36 fights. So he is 34. He's a little long in the tooth now. So this is definitely a late autumn potential for him. But he's not hard travelled. He's not been beaten up several times. And it's easy to forget for all his posturing that Chris Eubank is 33 himself, so no spring chicken. So they meet with different narratives about where they are in the career. Eubank seemingly still having the big future. It seems always to be with one step outside his grasp, and Liam Smith being portrayed as the guy with a little bit more past. But physically, there's not a great deal between them in terms of age or miles travelled.
Interesting. Okay, so they're probably, I suppose, for myself looking at it, I would have kind of thought Eubank was more of the up and comer, but as you said, that's maybe the image he sets up for himself, which he obviously does quite successfully. Given that was my sort of inclination. I suppose going back to some more conversation between the two fighters, Smith himself sort of alluded to 2 fights that Eubank has lost, 2 professional fights, I should say, were to George Groves and to Billy Joe Saunders. And Smith kind of made an allusion to Eubank maybe not being as good when he comes up against someone with good fundamentals or something along those lines. Does Smith share any of the attributes of George Groves Jr. and Billy Joe Saunders? Is he on their level, and can he cause Eubank the same problems that those 2 guys clearly did?
George Groves and Billy Joe Saunders, boxing fans will know, are 2 outstanding fighters, certainly from British shores, 2 of the best guys in and around the middleweight and super middleweight divisions that we've produced, and we've produced some very good men in those divisions. George Groves was a very heavy puncher, could probably have fought at light heavyweight quite easily and been successful. So there was no shame in Eubank losing to him when he was pretty green, and he came. Oh no, sorry. He fought Groves when he was at his peak, and Eubank was a little less travelled than he is now. And he came on quite strong in that fight towards the end. Didn't realise Groves was injured, couldn't close the show. But George Groves was probably at his peak at that point. There's no shame in that. Billy Joe Saunders, a very elusive fighter, very difficult to get on top of. And that's the fight when Eubank was very green and couldn't do anything with Saunders and lost. But wasn't stopped, wasn't embarrassed. Liam Smith is neither of those 2 men for a couple of reasons. Firstly, he doesn't punch as hard as George Groves does. He's a career light middleweight coming up to middleweight. And he isn't even at light middleweight. He isn't the puncher, even pound for pound, if you might say, that Groves was in the super middleweight division. And he's not elusive like Billy Joe Saunders. However, he does have the good fundamentals. He has a good jab. He's got good footwork. He won't be panicked under pressure. He can punch in combination. He's good to the body. He's just what you might call a good all-rounder. He's got a bit of everything, and he won't be phased by the first time he gets hit, I don't think. He's been in with big punches like Canelo Alvarez, and although he did touch down a couple of times before he was stopped in the 9th, he fought very well in that and didn't fold when under pressure. So I don't think Eubank is a tremendously big puncher. I think he's a solid puncher, and he perhaps catches people out with hand speed. So Smith will have to guard against that, but I don't think it's a case of the big bad middleweight is going to come in and demolish Smith with the first heavy shot he lands. I think that Smith won't be surprised by his punch power, and they have sparred before. So to answer your question, he does have a lot of those fundamentals. What's against him is the natural size factor. I think that's the thing that most pundits, most observers would say is going to be the problem for Smith and the advantage for Eubank.
Yeah, I think we have said in our conversations before, it's one of the old adages, you can't teach size, unfortunately, in any of the fighting sports or in any sport in general. I suppose, look, to round us out, I'd ask you for a prediction. As I said, you've written an excellent article for for the website. You've given sort of several scenarios or several ways this could go. I suppose, could you take us through a couple of those maybe, and the logic behind them, and then maybe round us out with the likeliest scenario of how you see this fight going, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, there's two or three things that come into this. We've talked already about the size factor, and that can't be dismissed. It's easy to want to, because sometimes you want to pull for the underdog. Sometimes you don't necessarily have the inclination towards the way that Eubank conducts himself. Maybe that turns you off. So you're looking for the Smith win. You have to remember that Eubank is the bigger guy. He's fought quite frequently at super middleweight, which is 2 divisions above where Smith has spent most of his career. He's taller. He'll have a little range advantage. He is supposedly, by the year or so, the younger man. And he will probably have the hand speed advantage. So there's a lot going for Eubank in that respect. But the other factors that come into it are those things that turn people off: the posing and strutting around, etc. Could be his downfall, in the sense of it could go 2 ways. His arrogance could mean that he believes that his power and his size is all he needs, and he can just walk through Smith. And I think if he does that, he will perhaps give Smith some opportunities to counter quite effectively. He could blow himself out. All those are possibles. I like Smith in this fight. I'm trying not to ignore the size factor, and I think it's the sign of a good fight that an observer can go kind of 2 ways on it. One day you might wake up feeling one thing, and another thing, and someone could sway your opinion, and you might consider something more important another day. So that will all unfold as we go towards fight night. But I like Smith in this fight. I think he's sturdy. He can take a shot. He's a reasonable 12-round fight. He's got a good engine for the longer distance. I think he'll be very motivated for this fight. He knows that a loss here is difficult to bounce back from and get opportunities at the pay grade that he's probably seeking. So it's a kind of all-in, chips in for this fight, I think, for Smith. He is coming up to middleweight, but at 34, the extra pounds could do him a service. And at 5'9.5", he's not a small guy at this weight. Eubank's 5'11". So I think there are things there for Smith too. So I see a longer fight. I allude to that in the article. I think that's the safer kind of avenue to pursue. I don't think Eubank does this early. I certainly don't think Smith does this early. So I think a longer fight, probably leaning towards points. And I think there's some value, modest though it may be, because Eubank is the house fighter. Even though we're up in the Northwest, he's the one, as we've alluded to, with the future. There may be some, not favoritism, but maybe some inclination to look for what Eubank's doing. But I think Smith could get this done. And I think that there's some value in those odds if you seek them out. On the distance, on the cards, as it were.
Absolutely, yes. So a bit of a turn up for the books, perhaps, in your opinion, maybe not guaranteed. But
yes, yeah. I hate to only just get off the fence, but it's that kind of fight. We mustn't ignore the size advantages he has. But I just like Smith to maybe squeak the upset here on points, and it would be a big upset in terms of people's anticipation or expectations, that the wider public, as it were, because Eubank is the name. I think in boxing circles, it's seen as a much tighter fight than that.
Absolutely. Well, sometimes the fence can be the best veranda for a fight like this. So we'll see you on Saturday evening. David, thank you very much, as always. As I said, people can find you at The Boxing Writer on Twitter. David's article will be linked to in the description of this video. And apart from that, David, we'll chat to you again very, very soon.
Yeah, look forward to it. Thanks, Darren.
Thanks, David.